Good evening, everyone, and thank you for joining us so prompt and early for tonight's lesson going over working with family members and peers. We're going to go ahead and take just a few more moments while we allow some of our other students to log in, to get over any technical issues, to navigate those web pages. In the meantime, if you have any questions for myself or my co-presenter, Alice, please feel free to send us a little message in the question box, and we will be more than happy to respond to those in time. All right, everyone. It is just a few minutes past the hour. It does not look like we have too many other questions. So without any further ado, I'm going to go ahead and jump into tonight's lesson over working with peers and families. So today's objectives, like we would like to accomplish before the end of today's training, we would like to cover in general, as mentioned earlier, working with families and peers, recognizing how to meet people during different stages of emotional crisis and response, which we will go into in more detail what those stages are. And then we'll talk more about effective strategies for supporting individuals through crisis, as that applies to both family members and peers. So today's lesson is being brought to you by myself over here with NAMI California, as well as my wonderful co-presenter Alice down in San Diego. You want to go ahead and give us a quick shout out, Alice?
Hi, everyone. I'm so glad to be here with you all tonight. My name's Alice, and I'm the Peer Recovery Programs Coordinator at NAMI San Diego. I've presented 2 other times with you guys, and I'm so happy to be back and to hang out with you all tonight.
Thank you very much, Alice. And without any further ado, let's move into one of our first definitions for the evening, and I'll be going over the role of family. So if you'd like to go ahead and jump in here, Alice.
Yeah, absolutely. So as we know today, family comes in many forms. There are single parent families, large and small families, same-sex parent families, and then what some traditionally call a traditional family. So we're going to take a look at what we primarily see as involved, quote unquote, family. So what does family look like to us in this way? And on the next slide, we're going to see 3 levels of family or significant other involvement. As family and peers support specialists, your responsibilities may include working with the individual or working with their family members. And when we say family, we have a pretty good idea of who that includes. Most people will think of, like their mom or their dad, but oftentimes the individual may have what's called an intentional family or otherwise known as like your chosen family. And this intentional or chosen family member may not be a blood relative, but a trusted friend who wants to or has been asked to support the peer or individual. So as we look at the slide, you can see the difference between the different levels of family involvement. So first at the top, we see primary caregiver. And this person is going to be the one who has the most direct involvement. So maybe the peer lives with this person or lives within very close proximity, but this person is very, very involved. The second one is family living with or near, but less exposed to behaviors and life fluctuations. So they may live near each other, they may check in once in a while, but they're not necessarily exposed to the every single day fluctuations or crisis that might be happening. And the third level right at the bottom says family not living in household, but shares common interest in doing what's best for the person living with the mental health condition. So for me, I would fall under the third one, my family not living in the household. My family didn't really have much involvement in my recovery, but I know that deep down they really want what's best for me. So that's kind of where I fall with my immediate family. But like I said, like we're going to get more into our chosen families, and you know who we choose to surround ourselves with is equally as important as who we're born with too. So on the next slide, we'll see working with family members. So this is all a list of all the people who we consider to be family members. So parents, spouses, children, extended families, friends, and as we mentioned before, intentional or chosen family members. So you may be working with family members on the same level of involvement, but you can't be sure that they're all on the same page in regards to their loved one. We have found that mental health challenges are most often impact the entire family as it does with any other illness that may be serious and persistent. So if we think about this in regards to a physical health condition, everyone has varying levels of physical health. You know, sometimes people get colds or sometimes people get the flu. I know that in San Diego, we just had this huge flu pandemic, you know, and when people get the flu, other people usually want to help them, take care of them, give them some soup, you know. And so we should have that same response when somebody's going through a mental health crisis and our loved ones and have that same level of care. However, if there's multiple family members involved with one peer, let's say there's a parent and maybe there's a significant other and then there's a friend, all three people may know different things about that peer. And so as peer and family support specialists, we need to be mindful of the dynamics of a family when we're working with everyone. So on the next slide, we will see helping family members gauge where they are emotionally. We must remember that we are working with people who are moving through experiences of trauma. And we have to keep that in mind while working with this population. Because in this role, we are directly interacting with people that are either going through crisis currently, have been through a crisis, but they all are experiencing different levels of trauma. And we often hear about trauma of our loved ones living with mental health conditions. Dr. Joyce Berland is the author of the NAMI Family to Family curriculum and family support group model. She developed this trauma stages of emotional response for family members to not only gauge where they might be emotionally, but also provide a list of needs during those various stages. So we're going to talk about that more on the next slide, but basically what we're going to show you are the stages of emotional response. So I'm sure a lot of people are familiar with the stages of grief. This is similar. So the stages of emotional response, where do we start and where do we end? And it's important to know that it's not linear. So if we start at the very beginning of an emotional response stage, we can kind of go all over the map with it. So I'll talk more about that in our next slide, and it is just important to remember that it was created by the same person who created the family to family model, and in family to family there's an entire class based on problem solving, and so this is kind of where that stems from too. Now I'm going to ask you guys a question. On the next slide we're going to do some question time. So does anyone want to share a brief example related to how they felt during the initial or during a crisis period? If anyone wants to type into the little question box that we have, I can read them out loud.
And particularly, we're interested in kind of your emotional response to it, like what those were, what thoughts, what emotions that you were grappling with, what was going through your head.
So I'll start while everyone types and thinks. So I think a brief example, the emotional response that I was at, I was actually, I think I was relieved. Because I had been experiencing these feelings for so long that I finally felt relieved that somebody was validating them and that somebody knew what was going on. I also did feel confused and scared. And although that moment of relief, like, oh, good, I finally figured it out, after that kind of initial feeling wore off, I was like, well, where do I go now? What do I do? And okay, oh, I see some people writing in. All right, so I'm gonna read some of your answers. One person said, can we repeat the question? Okay, so I'm gonna repeat the question for everyone. And it says, does anyone want to just share a brief example related to how you felt during the initial diagnosis period, or either yours or your family members, or during a crisis period, like the emotional response, like where were you, how did you feel? Someone said, when I received my diagnosis, I was relieved, but at the same time in denial because I did not want to accept the diagnosis. Yeah, I can completely understand that. You know, it's scary. It's the whole radical acceptance piece. If anyone's ever done dialectical behavioral therapy, there's this beautiful kind of experience that peers go through about radical acceptance. And if you haven't heard about that, there's like great videos about DBT, Marsha Linehan, who created DBT, and her talk about radical acceptance, about accepting ourselves, including our diagnosis. Someone else said, I felt like I was being simultaneously cast out of society and then being incorporated into a whole new category of experience. I felt isolated and then celebrated for my uniqueness. Oh, that's beautiful. I'm so glad you shared that. Yes, exactly. We should all celebrate our uniqueness. That is a wonderful perspective. Thank you so much for sharing that. Someone said, emotional response was worried, inquisitive, then I found my path, then relief. Good, thank you. Thank you so much. Someone else said, during my crisis, I felt lost, confused, scared, and angry. I felt understood when things were explained to me. Yeah, and you know, that's the exact feeling. If you think about it, when we're going through crisis or a loved one is going through crisis, when we are explained things, then we feel better. And that's our job as peer and family support specialists, to give people that kind of relief and that understanding. I'm going to read a couple more. I love how many people submitted. Someone said, when I was told I had depression and anxiety, I said, no, I don't, but I guess I did. Yeah, you know, it's that initial like knee-jerk reaction, like, what, me? No. But then you kind of went through the process and then you accepted it, and that's good. Someone said, scared that I had a diagnosis I had never heard of after being in psych services for over 15 years. After finding out what it was, overwhelmed that it was two disorders combined into one. Yeah, and so I can understand how, you know, that definitely like those two would feel really overwhelming. But it seems like you're here and you're in a good place and you're using your experience to give back, which is good. Someone else said, I felt happy that I finally knew. I felt like everything in my life finally made sense. Yes, that's how I felt. I was like, oh, that's why I was such a difficult person in my younger life. That makes so much sense. I wasn't just moody and petulant. I actually was experiencing something real, and that validation just really put my whole life into perspective. Yeah, so I see a lot of people, you know, initially I'm sensing that there was a lot of universal fear, confusion, like a lot of being uncomfortable, but it seems like everyone has taken that and accepted it and kind of moved forward into our own recovery paths. So thank you all so much for sharing. I really appreciate reading all your responses. So now we're going to talk about the stages of emotional response. So stage 1 is dealing with the catastrophic event. Stage 2 is learning to cope. So we refer to that as going through the mill. And stage 3 is moving into advocacy, which is known as the charge phase. Dr. Berland, Dr. Joyce Berland, and her team discovered from focus groups and course evaluations in the early years of support groups that she noticed 3 common stages of emotion from family members based on what was going on at the time with their loved one. The emotional responses are cyclical, although they are listed as stage 1, 2, and 3. A family member can be in phase 3 advocacy and their loved one has a crisis that takes the family member right back to stage 1. So it's important to know, just like recovery is not linear, the emotional stages of emotional response are not linear. So if you feel like you're in advocacy and you're doing really well, and then something happens and kind of turns you into a relapse situation, it's okay. We can still get back into stage 3. It's just all about building up that resilience when we go back to stage 1 and learning that we can always get back to stage 3. So the goal is to identify which stages the family members are in, to offer best support, education, and or resources for themselves and their loved ones. So the idea is if everyone is in a stage of recovery, so if we're looking at these 3 stages, there is a need that will be that needs to be met while somebody is going through these stages, and that is what we're going to go through on the next couple of slides, is addressing more detail what the stages are and what somebody would need when they're dealing with those stages. So on this stage is dealing with a catastrophic event. So you see this woman in the very nice knit sweater. She needs support and comfort. Okay, so she's dealing with crisis, chaos, shock, denial, and she might be hoping against hope. Like, as we always say, I always tell people in this role, there is always hope, and recovery is always possible. And I do believe those things. And at the same time, I also believe that when we experience catastrophic events, that type of hope can sometimes seem a little blurry. Although it's never gone, it can seem a little harder to grasp onto, especially during phase 1. So during the catastrophic event, what an individual needs is empathy for the confusion. So somebody that understands why they're confused, understands what they're going through. They need help finding resources. What type of things can we offer? How can their immediate needs be met? Early intervention. So as soon as we realize that the individual needs some support, definitely helping them get to that. The empathy for the pain, and also like referring them to NAMI if they haven't heard of it as before, shameless plug, reppin' NAMI. Number 2, the second one says learning to cope. So after an individual has transitioned from the first stage, they'll move into learning to cope, and they will need to vent their feelings. They'll need a lot of self-care. So they might be feeling anger, angry that this is happening to themselves or to their loved one. I know for me, when things happen to people that I love, I feel a lot of anger and injustice. I think things like, well, if how could this happen to this person? They're so great. And so I understand that. And, guilt, maybe you feel responsible for feeling this way yourself or for somebody else, resentment, recognition. So these are all, they're learning. They're going through the process of learning to accept and learning to kind of feel their emotions. What they would need is maybe they would need to talk to somebody to actually just kind of vent and blow off some steam. Educational skills training, so like a family-to-family class or a peer-to-peer class. In San Diego, we have a class called WRAP, which is through an organization called RI International, Wellness Recovery Action Plan for Peers. There's so many different types of resources that we could offer to people, especially when they're kind of just learning to cope. They also need to learn the letting go. We can provide a safe place for people, but we can't change them or force them to get help. And then the last thing that they need is hope. They need to remember that there is always hope. And even if it seems blurry, even if things aren't going well, the hope is something that we need to remind them of and have them hold on to it. So number 3 is moving into advocacy. And this is the understanding, acceptance, and action. So this is when a person has finally experienced all of this. They feel like their feet are planted in recovery, and they're ready to move forward and make a difference for other people. At this point, an individual would need restoring balance in life. So finding out who they are, the things that they enjoy, kind of rebuilding themselves back up. And activism and responsiveness from the system. So a lot of people, a lot of individuals that are in the advocacy stage will, start trying to volunteer or look for jobs. And when responsiveness from the system is really important. I know for me, if I'm going out to volunteer and I don't hear back and I'm trying to make a change happen, that can be really frustrating. And so it's just important that they are recognized and validated, and all of their efforts are validated too. So on the next slide, we're going to go into more of stage 1, so dealing with a catastrophic event. And so I know that we just went over this a little bit, but I'm going to go into more detail into each stage so we really get a comprehensive look at what each stage looks like. So like I said, dealing with a catastrophic event. So crisis, chaos, and shock, and the individual will be feeling overwhelmed, confused, and lost. Sometimes a catastrophic event is going on and we don't know how to deal with it, and our sense of emotional intact is shattered. So, we all have a limit as to what we can deal with, and we all have triggers. Everyone in the world has kind of all those things. So if they're feeling denial, it might be a protective response to giving us time to process the painful events that have turned our lives upside down. So if we are a peer or a family member and we're trying to provide services to them, it's important to understand that they might be in denial and they might comprehensively understand what's going on with themselves or with their loved one. They might not be able to accept it within themselves yet. They might decide that it's not really happening, or there's a perfectly logical explanation for these events and it'll pass, and we try to normalize what's going on. So instead of accepting it and trying to find resources, we just try to stuff it down, and that's a natural response when chaos happens or when not necessarily wonderful things happen. It is natural to not want to accept it. And then hoping against hope, the recognition and the hope that this is not what I think it is, and that something isn't easier to deal with. And we assume that if we're making a huge effort to change everything, that our lives will go back to quote unquote normal. So I know when I was, I always think if I do all these things, then I'll feel like a normal person, and normal's in quotes, but it's important to let people know that, everyone is in different places in their life. And just because somebody's in a state where they're experiencing a catastrophic event, they will be able to get through it. And that's what we're there to help them through, is to be able to honor and recognize that and not try to push them through it, and not try to say, you have to accept this and it will get better and you need to be into stage 2 and 3 now. Peer and family support is all about meeting people where they're at. And if you know me, I say that all the time, just meeting people where they're at. So if somebody is experiencing stage 1 and they're feeling denial or they can't accept any hope, then it's just important for us to remind them and to kind of meet them where they are and to, kind of guide them through and see what they need and how we can move them and walk along with them in their journey to get to stage 2. Families in this state need timely and comprehensive crisis response. They need sympathy and comfort, reassurance that it's all gonna, that everything will work out, and validation that their behavior is normal and understandable. So just telling somebody that what they're experiencing and their perception is valid is a huge thing. especially for me, I tend to get into my head a lot, and I'll tell myself that my thoughts aren't valid. And then when somebody tells me that, your thoughts are valid and you deserve to be, you deserve to validate your own thoughts and your own feelings, that's a huge thing. And if no one's ever said that to somebody, that can hold a lot of weight. So it's just about being compassionate and understanding and allowing that safe space for families or peers and the people that you're serving to have this crisis time, to allow them to ride this out and be there for them when they go through stage 2. So on stage 2, which is the next stage, we are going to talk about learning to cope. So once an individual has kind of managed to go through and they've kind of accepted it, they're not in denial anymore, they're going to need to learn some coping skills. These are some feelings that they might have while going through stage 2. Guilt, anger, resentment. This is something that that a peer or family member might be thinking. They could be thinking, I'm fed up with this, he needs to snap out of it. We start blaming the victim, insisting that the person should snap out of it or get back to work. And we feel fed up and do not want to handle it. Perhaps we distance ourselves from our problem. And at the same time, we can harbor tremendous guilt, fearing that it might be our fault. Then we compensate and get overly involved with a problem. And this can drain us. I mean, getting really involved and trying all you can to help somebody and then not seeing any results and then giving up and then feeling bad about giving up and then trying really hard again. It's a cycle. It's a cycle that we can experience in our personal and our professional lives. But as peer and family support specialists, it's important to recognize that the individual we're serving is going through this, and it might be a process that's a long time for them, and it might take them a little bit of time to kind of recognize that and break it. And recognition. So the fact that a catastrophic event has happened to someone we love as a family member has becoming a reality for us. So we're going through it and we're just not being in denial and we're accepting that it is reality. And it's clear that something tragic has changed our lives forever. And it's just, this is the acceptance piece. Everything starts with acceptance. Change can't happen without acceptance. Acceptance is definitely the catalyst for all process in recovery. We also might be feeling grief. We might be mourning the time before a diagnosis or before things got more difficult. And we really feel the tragedy of what has happened. And we are unsure of the future. And it just feels like we're not on solid ground. And there's a lot of grief. There's a lot of loss. For me, I remember my mom telling me when I was first diagnosed that one of the hardest things for her was like feeling like I hadn't, like I was going to miss out on something, like I hadn't had all these other experiences because I was so focused on my recovery journey. And, I really don't feel that way, but I can understand how as a family member she might feel like that grief and mourn that loss for me. And so I understand how it would be hard for her to see what I'm going through as well. So I've seen the perspective from my perspective as a peer, and I've seen the family perspective because I have family members that are peers, and obviously, I have family around me that has seen my recovery journey, and so I've seen it from both sides. But what a family member needs during stage 2, they need competent medical and system support to avoid a family tragedy. So if somebody is in a hospital setting, we definitely need competent a medical team. So a therapist or a psychiatrist, just a competent, trustworthy team that's able to help us through it. And that was where your position as a peer and family member falls in, because you would be providing that competent, safe place for them to be. They might need case planning, sensitive to their relatives' need for safety. They might need a long-term case management situation, but they'll definitely need concrete information about the diagnosis and the course of the mental health condition. I always recommend family to family to family members. I think that it is the best class to take if you have a loved one that's a peer. I think that's the first place that a family member uh, should look into if if they haven't looked into anything else. The NAMI family to family class is really great. And validation. In every single one of these is validation. Validation that that person is doing everything that they can. Validation that every little thing that they try is important and it does matter. And it's important that they practice self-care. It's and they also need inclusion in the treatment process um, to restore the sense of control. So if a family member is working with their peer or their loved one, and the family member and the peer and the family member are on the same page about being involved in the treatment process, then that's great. So then the acceptance of their need to be hypervigilant and over-involved, that is empowerment from the system. So a lot of family members I have seen, I've kind of seen both ends. I've seen family members like mine that become really detached and just kind of feel guilty and kind of remove themselves. And then I've seen family members that get super involved and kind of over-involved and super hyper-vigilant with the system, and they want to make a change. And that's actually where step 3 comes in. And so really it can go either way. But so let's review. So we've gone through when you've gone through the catastrophic event, when your family member is diagnosed, and then once you've kind of accepted it, you've moved into stage 3 or stage 2, I can count. And now you're in stage 3, which is moving into advocacy, which is our last stage.
Good job counting. I just want to give you that kudos real quick, okay?
Thank you. You know what? Sometimes counting is hard, okay? I watched a lot of Sesame Street and sometimes that still doesn't help me. All right, so moving into advocacy. So an individual or family member might be feeling that they are understanding. They're beginning to understand what it must be like for their family member and realizing that their family member is doing all that they can. They are acceptance. So stage 2 is a little bit of acceptance. There's kind of inching towards it. And stage 3 is like full on acceptance. The family member has acknowledged that it's no one's fault. It's sad and it's a difficult time, but we'll hang in there and we'll get through it. And advocacy. We need to change a world that shames those for mental health conditions and their families. I have a really quick story to share. So in San Diego, I co-facilitate a peer and family support specialist training as well. And we had our in-person class that graduated today. And during the first class, there was a woman in the class and she was really disgruntled, to say it nicely, because her son was out of boarding care and the boarding care was not necessarily up to her standards. There were some bed bug situations that were not pleasant, and I won't get too much more into it. So for the first half of the class, she was talking to us about this, and I was trying to get her resources. I was trying to get help for her son. And then today was the last day of class, and she stood up in front of everyone, and she told everyone that she was going to open her own independent living home, and she was looking into buildings to buy because she saw the quality of boarding cares. Not all boarding cares are bad, but in her opinion, she didn't agree with the quality of boarding cares, so she wanted to make it better. And she wanted to, like, in her words, have the best boarding care ever. And so that's what she's doing. She saw a problem, she realized that she could have a solution, and she's taking it into her own hands. And I believe that she's going to make it happen because this woman can make anything happen. But yeah, she's looking at buildings, she's getting permits, she's making it happen. And we can all do that. We can all see something and not be okay with it and make a change. And that's why we're in such a great position as peer and family support specialists, because we can facilitate that change and be catalysts for change as well. So when you are in the advocacy stage, an individual, a family member might be feeling understanding. they will gain a solid empathetic sense of what our family members are suffering from. With some of the fear behind them, they can grasp what the inner experience is for the other person, and they gain real respect for their courage and fortitude. So they're starting to understand, like in the family to family class, there's actually two classes. One class focuses on brain biology, and the other class focuses on like compassion and empathy workshops. So if a family member is experiencing their loved one having symptoms and they've never experienced mental health conditions before, it can be confusing. And so that understanding piece, really understanding where a peer is coming from, is so important. Like when I was going through like, when I go through a mental health crisis, I withdraw a lot. And so it's explaining to my family and to explaining to the people that love me, that doesn't necessarily mean I don't want to talk to you. That means I actually probably need you more if I'm withdrawing. And to have family understand and really get it, what's going on in their loved one's brain, that's a huge, huge step. The second thing that that a family member is experiencing is acceptance. So yes, we finally say bad things do happen to good people. We surely wish this trouble had not come, but it did, and we can accept it. It is not our fault, and it is not their fault. It is a difficult life experience, but we will hang in there. So it's the acceptance, accepting your loved one, accepting ourselves, just accepting the whole situation and knowing that we will get through it together. And the last one, advocacy and action. With a measure of acceptance, we can now focus our anger and grief and work to confront the system, and we are ready to come out to fight the stigma and to change the world that shames people with mental health conditions and their families. We may join public advocacy groups, we get involved, we become volunteers, we take this training. So if you are in this training, I'm assuming you might, most people are in the advocacy stage right now. You're taking this training, you're passionate about giving back to people. And so family members in this state need encouragement and comfort around the loss and help with adjusting to long-term goals. So they need to like open, and then it says open-hearted welcome into NAMI advocacy work. So I have seen so many family members come to NAMI and share the story that their family member had gone through something and it was really hard, but now they're ready to give back. NAMI is basically like split. It's half family and half peers. And so we work together, and we're able to really understand each other's perspectives. But being able to channel all of our misfortune and all of our life experiences and being able to like be a guiding light for other people, I think that that's the most impactful thing that we can do, and why this work is so important. Because you saw it, we've gone through a crisis, we accepted the crisis, and now we're ready to give back. And that is such a great thing such a great position to be in, really. And just a couple more things to remember about coming through trauma. So the practice of advocacy is an antidote to loss. The therapeutic use of action to compensate for the stop times in our life with our family members is most basically a flight from the grief of shattered dreams. So that is what Dr. Joyce Berlin believes, that as we're able to be advocates and fight through and either volunteer or work in the field, we're basically living in recovery as we're doing it. Advocacy and service work is a huge, huge recovery tool. In every stage of the emotional response, it's important to take care of ourselves. And when a family member gets stuck in one phase of this process, it simply means that they haven't reached the emotional resolution required to move on. And this happens because they are not getting what they need or deserve from others or the system, or they're not doing what they need for themselves. So family members move forward when their needs are understood and met by others, and when their feelings are validated and accepted. So that basically means that we can't push people along this path, and we can't force anyone to do anything at all. We can't force anyone to get help or to get therapy. And if somebody is in stage 1 for a prolonged period of time, the only thing we can do is meet them where they're at and try to help them in whatever way they need at that moment. So some important things to remember and take away, if you take away anything from this, the stages of grief, it's going to be on the next page. So we're going to remember 4 things. So the first thing that's important to remember is that none of these responses to catastrophic events are pathological or wrong. They are normal reactions everyone experiences when faced with traumatic events causing critical disruptions in our lives. So every single person would feel different levels of this. Number 2 is these stages are not necessarily progressive. People are often in more than one state at a time. So just remember that, there might be a combination of stages. There might be somebody who's in an advocacy stage, but they're also at the same time managing a crisis. So people sometimes feel that they are beginning to gain acceptance, and then a relapse takes them right back to stage 1. And that's okay too. Number 3, different family members are often at different places in the cycle. So different family members are experiencing different things. And this is why family members have difficulties communicating with each other and agreeing on what to do, because everyone thinks that they know what's right, and everyone has a different relationship with the peer that's close to them. So it's just important to take everyone, whoever you're serving. So if you're serving the peer, then that's important to take their requests into account. And if you're serving the family member, and if you're working as a team, it's just important to just be careful of those dynamics and just be mindful that everyone is at a different stage. And if we understand the stages, then we're better able to serve the people when they're in them. Number 3 is, or I just read number 3. Number 4, although the stage model appears to be prescriptive, it's not about expectations. This is an individual journey that each person travels in their own way, but it offers hope to family members to know that they do progress through pain and grief to acceptance. So that's basically saying that these 3 phases are not going to be linear. You can be in more than one at once, and it's not a guide and it's not a prescription of how you will deal with it, but these are things that people feel, and it is really important to be able to write it down and pinpoint where people are at certain times during a crisis. So it's an important guide. It's important to understand the way that they're feeling and their needs at that moment. So the next slide is going to be talking about providing family psychoeducation and evidence-based practice. Vital components of family psychoeducation. There's going to be peer and family involvement. So it's both. It's a collaboration of efforts on both the peer and the family member side. There's going to be education about mental health conditions. What do they look like? Things of that nature. Developing problem-solving skills. So problem-solving skills is one of my favorite modules because I just think it's so important. You can use problem-solving skills in your personal life, your professional life. You can be solving problems all over the place. And then also about stress reduction, because as a self-care is huge. It's so important, especially in this line of work. We are giving so much of ourselves, and we're putting out so much of our own battery power that we need to make sure that we are reducing our stress, increasing our self-care when possible to really make sure our batteries are at like 100% so we can give back to others. And long-term duration. So just making sure that, going to a therapist once, that it's probably more beneficial to go a couple times. So just making sure that that you do have a long-term plan as a family member or a peer for self-care and for recovery. And now that we've looked through the stages that family members go through, from learning to deal with a catastrophic event through learning to cope to moving into advocacy, we're going to take a look from the peer perspective. But before we do, this is the kind of tools and terminology you may be exposed to as a peer or family support specialist. One term you're most likely to hear is evidence-based practice. I hear that all the time. Evidence-based practice. There are thousands of strategies and therapies. Some of them include cognitive behavioral therapy, also known as CBT, dialectical behavioral therapy, DBT, aromatherapy, acupuncture, yoga. There's so many different types of therapy, alternative therapies. Practitioners in the behavioral health field generally gravitate towards strategies that can show evidence of success through research. Research includes clinical expertise and patient values and preferences. Family psychoeducation is an evidence-based practice that seeks to have practitioners, peers, and family members work together to support recovery. So this is really important. So it's basically the proof and the evidence that peer and family support does matter and it does work. And to have psychoeducation practices, it has to have all these vital components that I just read to you. So on the next slide, we're going to see the outcome. So what is the outcome of family psychoeducation? Well, if we include peers and family members and providers all into the education process, it shows that the outcome is proven. Reduced relapse rates, reduced hospitalizations and utilizations. That means that less people are going to the hospital, less people are utilizing services, crisis services, improved family knowledge. Yes, of course, family members are going to be more knowledgeable. They're going to be more understanding of what's going on. May improve family problem solving. May reduce family stress. May assist in family recovery. So the last three, it says research remains preliminary. But still, research shows that peers who participate in family psychoeducation programs had 20 to 50% fewer relapses. 20 to 50% fewer rehospitalizations than those who received standard individual services over 2 years. Studies show that family psychoeducation does improve families' well-beings. So I think, math probably was, math and science and that kind of stuff was like my least area of skill. I'm not very skilled with the number situations, as we saw from my earlier attempt at counting. But I will say that when we do these type of things and we have tangible evidence of like numbers and percentages and actual evidence that peer and family support changes lives and makes a huge positive impact and a difference, those type of numbers and that type of like tangible evidence is important to get funding to keep peer and family support work alive. And it's just important to just be aware of this tangible evidence so that we can say, yes, peer and family support specialists do work. Having family psychoeducation, it does reduce relapse, it does reduce hospitalizations. And so we're not just out here talking for no reason. We got proof, we've got numbers. So on the next slide, we're going to talk about the NAMI principles of support. So the NAMI. Oh yeah, go ahead.
If I could just jump in real quick, we're throwing around this term psychoeducation a lot. I would also just clarify. So some researchers, some clinicians would classify NAMI educational programs, such as family to family and peer to peer. That would be one example of a psychoeducational program. Just so there's a reference point for some folks.
That was great. Thank you for sharing that. I'm glad you specified. So the NAMI principles of support. So I oversee, one of the programs that I oversee here is Connection Peer Support Group. And as the name would suggest, it is a support group for peers. And before every single support group, we actually read the NAMI principles of support. So we'll pass this list around, we'll have everyone read it. And this is just the way that NAMI views support. And it's kind of like our universal mission. And I just think that this is really great. I love this model. I actually want to print it out and put it on my wall. I think I will. But so the first one says, we will see the individual first, not the illness. This is also referred to as person-centered language or person-first language, recovery language. It's also known as trauma-informed care language. It's all just seeing the person first and not their diagnosis. Number 2, we recognize that mental health conditions are medical illnesses and may have environmental triggers. Number 3, we understand that mental illnesses are traumatic events. Number 4, we aim for better coping skills. Now, not perfect coping skills, not necessarily flawless coping skills, but better. Better than before, just better, as long as we're always trying. Number 5, we find strength in sharing experiences. And this one is exactly what we are doing right now. And this is what you do as family and peer support specialists. You storytell, you raise awareness and advocacy through sharing your experiences as a peer or a family member. Number 6, we reject stigma and do not tolerate discrimination. I always say that, like, I like to provide safe space. And so if you know me, I'm always like, this is a safe space. You know, we've got a safe space here, because that means not judging, not discriminating. We accept everyone. We don't, we understand different perspectives, whether that be cultural or anything of that nature, but we don't discriminate. We accept everyone. We just want to help. Number 7, we won't judge anyone's pain as less than our own. This is actually something that we were discussing in our in-person class, that 2 people might experience the same thing, and one person, it affects heavier than the other person. So everyone has different types of ways that they cope with something. So just because somebody else experiences something and their reaction is either more intense and severe than yours would be, that's not for us to judge. It's just for us to understand that that root emotion is what they're feeling. So maybe we all haven't experienced a loss of someone we love, but we can all understand feeling lonely and confused. And so understanding those base emotions, we're not judging them that their pain is less than ours or more than ours. We're just saying we're all universal and we all have pain and we're all here to help each other through it. Number 8, we forgive ourselves and reject guilt. Number 9, we embrace humor as healthy. I think humor is an excellent pathway for recovery. You know, one of the compliments that I got in the in-person class that we just had was that it was funny and it was fun. And I think, you know, you can talk about serious things, but, you know, being able to laugh is really, it is important. It's a huge part of recovery, just being able to have that joy in your life. Number 10, we accept we cannot solve all problems. Yes, this one is very hard for me because I am a problem solver, people pleaser. I'm working on it. But, you know, we can't solve people's problems, but we can create a safe space, provide resources, meet them where they're at, kind of walk along the path with them and kind of guide them along and have them be in their driver's seat. But we can't solve anything, but we can assist. Number 11, we expect a better future in a realistic way. You know, so the epitome of mindfulness is accepting the past, being excited for the future, but not anxious about the future and just enjoying the present moment. So we can have hope for the future, but it's not unrealistic. And number 12, we will never give up hope. And that one is a big one because no matter what is going on, no matter how many times our loved ones or ourselves or whoever experiences a relapse, I always say it's not about the amount of times that we fall down, it's about the amount of times that we stand up and that resiliency that we can keep going. And no matter what happens, we know that, you know, the recovery is possible. And our resiliency just keeps going up and up. So next time a crisis happens, we'll be able to deal with it better than we did this time and forward. So just never give up hope, and just let other people know never to give up hope, and just spread that around. So those are all of our NAMI principles of support and the lens that we see support through. So now it's question time. Do you guys have any thoughts, feelings, concerns that you'd like to share about what we just went through? And I will read the questions out loud and address them if anyone has any. You can type them in the question box. Okay, so it doesn't look like I'm getting any questions yet.
That's okay. Let's go ahead. We can move forward, and
okay.
If anyone does have, Nora. Okay, so Nora asked if we can repeat the question, and we're just simply asking everyone if you have any questions about the family stages of recovery before we move into the second section, which will address peer stages of recovery. And if you don't have any questions, that's fine. If you're still coming up with some, you can go ahead and message them over while I talk about peer stages of recovery, and we can take a minute to answer them, or Alice can reply to you specifically. So thank you for that presentation, Alice. That was wonderful, very informative. Love your energy.
Thank you.
So in a kind of tandem, so that was the family member perspective in terms of recovery. So now we're going to discuss a little more about the peer stages of recovery. So a key component for family and support partners and support specialists is also to understand this other secondary kind of stage of crisis and recovery. Peer support specialists should be aware, they should be able to recognize, acknowledge, and support family members and loved ones where they are in the stages. And you need to be ready, just like working with family members, to meet individuals where they're at in this stage, and sometimes be prepared to juggle working with family members as well as working with peers who may be at different stages in recovery or be sliding or moving forward and backwards. Again, if we remember what Alice mentioned earlier, recovery is not a linear path. It can definitely take different turns, ascensions and descensions given time. So a lot of the materials we're about to discuss, I just want to provide the source. They were developed through an initiative by this organization called Bridges Incorporated. They are a nonprofit out of the Los Angeles region that provides a variety of mental health services like outpatient treatment, discharge planning, and they were able to compose this based on their own research with peers. And we'll have the source for this at the end of the lesson, but the name of their report was Building Recovery of Individual Hopes and Dreams Through Group Education and Support. So a lot of these lessons were learned during psychoeducation programs, much like NAMI's family-to-family or peer-to-peer, just done in a different context and with a more peer-centered approach. So let's go ahead and move forward. So as we've already mentioned a couple of times, we have to be prepared to meet individuals where they're at along this continuum of recovery. Ultimately, recovery is a process through which peers will do themselves. It's something that each individual is responsible for. And it's not anything clinicians, therapists, peer support specialists, or even family members can do for that individual, which is why a critical aspect of being a peer support specialist is promoting within recovery is self-empowerment. Not only are you there to provide hope, to be that linkage to necessary services, but you're also helping to build up those skills so that individuals can be more involved, more responsible for their own recovery. Oops, sorry about that. Unnecessary question slide. So here are the initial stages of emotional response that peers will go through. We'll go into deeper detail in terms of breaking up these different stages, but in general, they can start with the crisis phase. This can typically be classified by a variety of features, such as on the screen in front of you. After the crisis, we see that we see the decision phase, which is wherein peers realize that there is some type of condition which they need to address, and that they must take some type of active decision in order to promote a more healthy, better recovery. Once they have started that journey, we move into the awakening phase, which Allison mentioned earlier as part of like the DBT therapy. But again, this is kind of that realization, acceptance of the whole person, you know, mental health condition and all, and realizing that given that context, that one can still pursue dreams as well as pursue their own initiatives. Give me 1 second. Let me just look at some of the questions that we have. So Maria asks a very, very good question. She asks, if a family member can't move on to the next step in the process, can that influence other members to get stuck too, or to relapse, and what can be done to undo that? So that is a pretty tough question. I would say that definitely that can be that can have influence upon a peer stage of recovery. If family members, for example, are not stuck getting out of that first stage, or they're continuously in denial, that can definitely make treatment or you know, searching for recovery more difficult. And that's kind of part of being able to meet individuals where they're at, to be able to recognize that the strategy that you employ with a family member who might be at a different stage in understanding the crisis and trauma that their child is going through may require different tactics to reach out to that individual to let them know where they need to be at on this continuum. So that's one place I would stick with that. Is there anything that you might like to add to that statement, Alice, about this this contrast in you know, peer as well as family member differences in stages of recovery? Alice? That's all right. We can come back to that, Maria. And when it comes to some of the tactics we'll cover, we will go over more detail things like verbal and as well as nonverbal communication skills, as well as things like motivational interviewing in separate lessons, which are more of these specialized skill sets to kind of prepare oneself for. In the short term, it's more, let's go ahead and lay the foundation, talking a little bit about the different stages of recovery so that we kind of know the playing field, so to speak, in which we'll be working with peers and family members in that context. And we'll come back and revisit your question. So with that being said, we're going to go ahead and start with our first stage of emotional crisis for peers, which is crisis and recuperation. So all these 3 stages can be broken up into an additional 3 factors. So kind of the influence that this will have on peers, so kind of how they respond in this situation, the emotions that typically are evoked when people are experiencing these different stages, and the different needs that individuals will need, both from family members and from the medical community. So the first one for crisis and recuperation. So generally after this period, you know, whether that be an emergency room visit, a possible suicide attempt, other types of traumatic instances, typically that process results in a lot of exhaustion, physical, mental exhaustion. The process, the experience is usually pretty harrowing. It can take up a lot of time going to the hospital, maybe being under a 72-hour hold. It's one of those things that is just not over quickly whatsoever, and there's still usually those ramifications from the experience. And so that tends to leave people quite emotionally exhausted, as a slide in front of you suggests, in all categories of self, mind, body, and spirit. And so some of the emotions that tend to come up in those situations are kind of all over the place. You know, general confusion. There can be a lot of anger or resentment at the situation, at family members, at oneself. There can be a lot of guilt involved for, you know, this perception of being burdensome or taking your family member through this process. We usually see a lot of people start grappling with ideas of stigma as well, because of the seriousness of this situation. And that all kind of combines within the grand context to be these negative emotions that are continuing to like pull someone down during these tough times. And so to kind of address these different emotional responses, these different pressures that someone is under during the crisis phase, it's important to be aware of the needs that we can provide to individuals. So typically, again, if we go back to this idea of being completely mentally and emotionally exhausted, typically individuals need simply food, water, support, a safe place to rest, whether that be respite homes, whether that be in some type of facility, whether that be with loved ones. But in general, being able to be there to pick up on those more mundane tasks, to give people that relief so they can begin to kind of address their own self-care, whether that be coming to terms with kind of that emotional trauma, whether that be just processing the events, whether that be talking about the events that just transpired, trying to relieve those other burdensome tasks that kind of come with everyday life so that individuals can focus more on their own self-care is critical to this first stage. Once we have kind of moved through the crisis and now we are set up for recuperation, as we improve and we go into our second stage of emotional response, we move into the decision and rebuilding stage. So at this point, individuals have gone through their traumatic experience, they've gone through crisis, they have got to the point where they are now ready to begin that first step towards positive recovery. And this starts with rebuilding some of that sense of independence. So this is where we're trying to promote within peers, and we're trying to promote within family members to support peers to do this, is beginning those steps of we were in the crisis phase of trying to be there to support an individual during this emotionally exhaustive time. Now we're trying to prep someone to now be in charge of their own recovery. We're starting to try and prep those skills for self-empowerment. And so if we refer to the rebuilding independence on the left, you'll see just what I was mentioning. At this point, we're trying to start trying to build some of those skill sets, whether that be the development of a RAP action plan, whether that be the starting the first step of going out into support groups, whether that be the difficult process of identifying what type of therapy options are right for you. We're taking those first steps to putting in structure. We're putting in place something to promote recovery and to negate the downward slide that took us to crisis in the first place. Some of the emotions that are happening at this phase as well can be around different, extremes within this axis. They can be everything from a very hopeful, sunny outlook. Now that we've gone through this process, I'm ready to get things back in order. I'm ready to start doing this, start doing that. And then conversely, there can be this sense of grief once we come to this realization that some people may, for the first time, be accepting their diagnosis at this phase, at this stage. After they've had this a crisis or they've had a traumatic episode, and now that they're convinced of their own mental health condition, and coming to terms with that, trying to accept that experience can also be incredibly disheartening. Once you realize that to look forward to, once you start trying to process that into your own identity. So the same way that people, is very possible they may be hopeful about the future, about whatever kind of treatment plans, what kind of recovery journey they may be on. In that same vein, other individuals may be incredibly hesitant. They may be very doubtful, may be very scared about what the future might hold. So those are some of those more common emotional responses at this time, generally around either a very positive, excited outlook, or more of an anxious, fearful outlook. And this could even fluctuate within the same individual, but more importantly, we're trying to foster this idea that people should be proud of the successes that they're making, whatever that may be at this stage. So some of the needs to be cognizant of as a peer support specialist is, at this phase, people may want to start sharing their story, start talking more about their own condition, talking more about the instances that led up to the crisis and recuperation stage that we just exited. Being able to talk about those experiences can allow people to learn more about their own condition, to become more familiar with community, to start reaching out into different social groups, and start to learn some of those skills to promote self-empowerment and promote recovery. And that leads us to our final stage of emotional response, and that is the awakening and recovery. So from here, we are helping peers to build healthy interdependence. So what this means is individual peers know exactly where they're at in terms of their own self-care. They know what they need to do. They know what symptoms to be aware of. They have plans in place, and they also know what resources to turn to. Typically, when people experience severe crisis the first time around, whether that be trips to the emergency room, the hospital, even the criminal justice system, in some cases, it may simply be because the family member and peer at the time did not know where to go for any type of crisis relief. But now, at this point, we've talked with clinicians, we've had peer support specialists make us aware of what opportunities exist in our local community, whether that be outpatient treatment, whether that be respite homes, whether that be peer support groups in the area. And so now that we've kind of got these tools, we have a better understanding of our own condition. We have a better understanding of our support group. We have these other tools to draw on in regards to promoting self-recovery. Individuals start to become more dependent in terms of being more in charge, more responsible. We typically also see more positive emotions begin to surface. For example, this self-acceptance, being able to awaken, be aware of the whole person and be accepting of that whole person. The appreciation for others, such as those who have been able to support you, those who have gone through similar experiences, gone through other traumatic experiences and are now, in their own recovery, and being able to appreciate the strength and the courage that it takes for that. In the same vein, many individuals also become aware of the different injustices that are present in their community. They become aware of the stigma. They become aware of organizational deficiencies that did not allow them to seek services in the first place. They become aware of providers that maybe are not operating the best practices. And this sense of awareness leads to an anger at that injustice. And hopefully, our goal is to nurture that into, well, you've got to this stage in your life. You are now in your at this high point of your recovery. You're aware of what issues persist in the community. How can we get you involved to helping others? And that kind of fits into helping people to build up these dreams and these visions, helping people to identify their short-term and long-term goals. And that's one reason why the peer support program as it is so fantastic. It allows people who have now kind of reached that critical juncture in their own recovery to say, now I can take these skills, I can take these experiences and apply them to something bigger than myself. I can take what I've learned and now share this with other family members, share this with other peers. And it becomes like a self-replicating journey where the first generation or the first group is helping out the next group of either peer supporters as well as family members. So those are the three primary stages of emotional response for peers. I know that was a little bit shorter than the questions and the topics that Alice was covering. I'm going to go ahead and take a few moments just to talk a little bit about any questions we may have. If we went to Alice, by any chance, have you joined us again?
Yes, I am here.
Okay, cool. So we have a question in the comment by Maria, kind of about like how to respond for family members who may be at a different stage in the emotional response than their loved one. And I was wondering if you had any comments you might like to add on that question.
Yeah, I think it's really about just honoring each individual space and not trying to push anyone or pull anyone towards another direction. So like if you're on number one and somebody else is on number three, they're not trying to take you to three and you're not trying to take them to one. So I think just having that open communication and that conversation where you say, I've noticed that you're acting this way and I think this is what is going on where I'm acting this way. How can we meet in the middle and have both of our needs met? And I think it's really just about having that open communication. And you could even teach them what you taught in teach them what you taught in this class. Teach them what you learned in this class about the different stages and try to have an open conversation and see where that goes. That would be my suggestion. Does that kind of help?
While we wait on Maria's response, again, like I was mentioning, we will have other classes that talk a little bit more about specific strategies to use when you're working with family members and peers. Like, for example, motivational interviewing. This process of kind of like a guided conversation to kind of get at what issues are underlying maybe the breakdown of communication between a family member and a peer. And once you can kind of diagnose that within the relationship, like where in that relationship maybe is that head coming to, where are they meeting the most difficulty in kind of passing, you as that peer support specialist will then have the ability to recognize that, kind of say, well, based on a lot of the evidence-based practices out there, based on my own personal experiences, kind of looks like this is where you are coming from. And you can start to offer that support, that guidance moving forward to kind of mend that relationship. Not so much like, to reiterate what Alice was saying, we're not trying to pull people into a certain way of thinking, but to be able to, diagnose where those issues are coming from, help to alleviate them, so that then family members can be better informed to support their loved ones. But that was an excellent question. Is there anyone else in the group that might want to inquire a bit more as to the peer stages of recovery? Maybe talk a little bit about the contrast between the two of them, and the similarities. Does anyone, just for off the top of my head, can anyone name us back the 3 stages of family member emotional response? Okay, I think a few people are asking for like an overview of the 2 differences. I'd be more than happy to do that. Give me 1 second, and I'll go ahead and pull that up.
Of the differences between the family member or the peer?
Exactly, yes. So we're talking about the similarities and differences between the 2.
Okay, got you. I'm caught up now. I understand. Sometimes my brain takes a little to process.
So here is the stages of emotional response for family members. So you'll see similarities, mainly that we are working within multiples of 3 here. So both of them are going to, in general, kind of deal with this. They start from the point of catastrophic event or crisis. And this is actually kind of representative of how the public mental health system treats the community in general. It's more of a fail first system, is how I've heard it described by others. Maybe as a community, as a society, we don't do enough in terms of prevention, early intervention, and diagnosis. And so typically a lot of people will go quite a long time without ever being formally diagnosed, without ever receiving the support they need, until they get to the point where it's so bad that then they encounter either the emergency medical system, the mental health system, or the criminal justice system. And that's usually the impetus, that first step into treatment. And so that's kind of how this model is presented as well, which I take a little bit of issue too, because I think if we were a bit more informed about mental health, we could spot some of the symptoms. We could do more earlier on with the onset of symptoms to negate some of these more traumatic experiences. But in general, we'll see that both programs start with this catastrophic event. So let me go from here. Let me show the family member slide. I'm sorry, the peers. So here we have the stages of emotional response for peers. And again, our first phase is one of crisis. Then our second stage is that decision to effectively begin the recovery process. And so in a similar vein, we see that for family members, that second stage, that second emotional response stage, is learning how to cope for themselves. So while peers are in the process of making that conscious decision and effort to seek treatment, to begin that recovery journey, parents in this stage, or family members, I should say, are learning to accept, to cope with their family members' mental health condition, and they're learning some of the strategies, some of the skills to be more supportive. And so if it all coincided, they'd be learning their own coping skills and how to support their family member simultaneously as a peer, as their family member is making that decision or moving into that decision phase. Let me take a quick minute. Looks like we have some questions, comments. Okay, good. And essentially, so I would say the second phase is probably the most different between the two stages, because the first stages in both comparisons begin with the crisis or traumatic episode, but the final stage for both is pretty similar. So for peers, it's this idea of awakening, of acceptance, of accepting one's identity, realizing that you can still have hopes and dreams and goals within that, and typically that leads to advocacy. Well, for family members, this third stage is advocacy. It's learning how to, now that we've came to terms with the conditions that are affecting our loved one, what can we do now as loved ones, as parents, to advocate more effectively for that individual? What can we do to better support our loved one? So that is, in general, part of the three-part of the contrast and similarities between those programs. If you are still having questions, I would also remind everyone that the handouts that were sent out last week for the registration email, they can all be found on the right-hand side of the screen, and they'll tell you a little bit more about the different stages of recovery as well. So with that in mind, we're just going to end tonight's lesson finally on one short video. So Alice, when I play this video, I'm going to need to transition the audio that I'm using from my phone to the computer. And so once the video ends, it's going to take me just a few minutes to dial back into the call, okay?
Okay, sounds good.
All right, everyone. If you would also just send me a little message, let me know that you can still hear the video okay. That would be very helpful. Give me 1 second. I'm actually going to make sure that my audio on my computer is good. Hello, everyone. Sorry about that. It looks to be that that the link that we had associated with that video is no longer up and functioning. Don't you just hate it when that happens? Well, that being said, we can go ahead and begin closing out our lesson. If there's any more questions, comments, or concerns, we can go ahead and take those now. As I mentioned earlier, here is the reference sheet. You can find this on the PowerPoint slides that were sent out. If you would like to look into these programs a bit more, you should be able to find all of these in a simple Google search. Most of them have the website address that you can find it at. I would also want to remind everyone that you should receive a survey at the end of tonight's lesson. You should either receive it a short hour after this lesson ends or by tomorrow. And again, that's just asking about the program. Please make sure that you are completing your evaluations. Hey, fantastic. Thank you all for your support in the comments. If you do not have any further questions, that will be the conclusion of tonight's lesson. I'll go ahead and remain on the call for a few more minutes. I'd be more than happy to give any updates, for example, about peer certification, or to talk more about next lessons. And if you want, Carol, I think you're more than happy to stay. I think people are just going to continue to shower you with praise, but if you want to and call it a night, I'll be fine. I can go ahead and close up the webinar.
Okay, well, thank you so much for having me tonight, you guys, and it was a pleasure. Have a really good night, and thank you. Bye.
Talk to you. Have a great evening, Alice.
You too. Bye, everyone.
Don't forget, everyone, you still have your surveys, your evaluations. I've also had a few people ask me questions about the career planning process. Again, if you have not been contacted by your local, the affiliate partner that is working within your service region, that's fine. They're still wrapping up again with the last cohort, and they should be all reaching out to you by next month. We still have all of July to finish out these programs. So I'll be sending out the registration links for next week. I'll send those out tomorrow morning. Be on the lookout for that. If you don't receive it tomorrow, please let me know so I can make sure that you receive that. And so, yeah, so about the link to the video in the registration emails that I send out every Friday, if you'll look at the bottom of those registration emails, I actually put links to all of the previous lessons. All of those recordings are there. So yeah, you should be able to review any of the previous lessons as long as you have the most recent registration link. And so you can use that if you miss a class and you need to make up your homework, which I know a few of you have missed a class or two. So please make sure that you are following up with me on that. I need to make sure that you get the quiz so that you can take that. All the quizzes are quite short. They're only 3 questions just to assess that you watch the video. And I need to make sure that you do those. A couple of people are asking about the surveys. So the surveys will be sent to you automatically when this webinar ends. They usually go out about an hour after the webinar ends, and all of the previous surveys are still open. So if you've attended any of the webinars, upon completion of the webinar, you should have received an automatic reply from the GoToWebinar software, and that should have the link there. And if you're still confused or having issues about that, please let me know, and I can always just send you the individualized survey links. So did that answer? Right. Okay. So so the quiz is only if you miss a class, and it's only a 3-item quiz. So if you miss a class, that procedure is you watch the recording, you take the quiz on the recording, you send me the completed quiz, you email it back to me, and then I can mark you off as having made up that class, and you can be well on your way to receiving your certificate of completion. So I hope, I think that might have answered everyone's questions regarding links, assessments, all of that good technical stuff. If I haven't answered your question, like I said, I'll go ahead and remain on the line for a few more minutes. I want to make sure that everyone is feeling supported, all on the same page. Thank you as well, Ms. Nora. I hope that you are able to do the same. I hope you all have a wonderful weekend. Hey, thank you, John. I'm glad you appreciate that. I'm thinking about, and this is something that you can always either message me or say in the surveys, any like additional changes you would like to see to the material. But I'm thinking about adding near the end of the presentation a slide specifically designed to compare and contrast the two stages, kind of like as a recap. And you know, and it looks like that you kind of already think that's a good idea. So I think that's really all the rationale I need. Now that I have that little bit of social support, I can finally feel comfortable to go follow my ideas. So I think we'll add that in there. And if you have any other suggestions, John, please shoot them my way. I really appreciate them. Okay. Well, I believe that will go ahead and be a good note to end on for the evening. If you have any other questions, feel free to email me, call me. I'll be in the office all day tomorrow prepping for sending out your registration links. Again, if you don't receive that tomorrow afternoon, make sure that you reach out to me, let me know. And I hope to see you all in class next week. Hope you all have a wonderful weekend. Take care.